The candidate we have today was targeting a senior product management role at a general tech company, no specifically Amazon or Google, but general tech. And the question asked was focused on the leadership principle of delivers results. And specifically, it was asking about a time when they were working towards project completion or goal, and they were more than halfway through, but realized it may not be the right path, or that they discovered potentially new unintended consequences of the path that they were on. What was the situation? What they do about it? And what I want you to really, really, really pay attention here is not a spoiler alert, but it's a mini spoiler alert. Really pay attention is one, depth of field on your answer. How good a job do you do when you're providing an answer to an interviewer in an interview? That's number one. But two, consistency in terms of how you walk through your analysis and making sure that there's no like logical fallacies in terms of I said A and then I said B and they don't really work together. And so is that really the right answer? And then C, how good are you in hindsight, right? Because really not every story that you're going to present in any interview is going to be from your last job. It might be from 2 jobs ago, 3 jobs ago, whatever. And so the real key for you in any role, doesn't matter if you're product manager or anything else, is demonstrating growth and that you've learned, et cetera. And so the question then becomes, okay, I did this thing. In this case, we were doing a thing and we decided to change paths because we were not making progress, or any number of things could have gone wrong. Do you have the ability now to look back on that and with the target level that your role that you're going for, be able to convince me that you can do that job? You might have made rookie mistakes in the past. And in this case, the candidate it was their first time managing an API integration, which, it's a very specific skill set for a product manager. And it's fine if it's your first time that you might have made mistakes. And those aren't the red flags. The red flags are when you walk through your answer with the benefit of hindsight and, in theory, preparing for this interview that you're now having. Do you have the ability to walk through an answer that helps me understand why what you were working on was important? Why did it take you so long to make a decision or to get to the point where you change your mind, right? Sometimes the 50% is just a function of, well, that's how much work needed to get done to get to that decision point. And sometimes it's, man, we just weren't paying attention to the things that were important. And it turns out we got really far down the road and realized we'd made a mistake. It's good to be able to talk through that in your interview. And then finally, are you using data to support any discussion that you're trying to have in the room? And if you're not using data with specific examples, even if you don't remember the exact data, use the metrics, right? But help me get to a point where I believe that you're highly competent at your role. Because ultimately, if I'm hiring for any seat in my company, whether it's product manager, developer, whatever it is, if I'm hiring for any seat, I want the most competent person. And the most competent person is, are you that person sitting in that seat right now? That's who I'm targeting. It's the person in the seat right now, not the person you were 2 years ago. When the story, I don't care. I care a little bit, but I don't care. What I care about is, can you walk me through the story with the level of maturity and competency that I expect for a person sitting in that seat who's looking for this role? Can you do it? I'll let you decide if we get there. As always, if you want to work with me via VIP mock interview or you want access to my content library, the links are below. One of the hard parts about being a product manager is that there are pivots, right? Restarts, all kinds of challenges when you're working towards a plan or objective. I'd be curious to hear about a time where you were working towards a project, service, delivery, something, right? A goal, whatever, it doesn't matter. But working towards something, and you were more than halfway there and realized that you may not be on the right path, or that you discovered potentially new unintended consequences, right? What was the situation? What'd you do?
Sure, absolutely. So similar to kind of the team, to just reframe it again, when I was on with TD Ameritrade, when I was a middleware product manager, building services, so people come to me a lot of requests. So I'm building a little bit on what I just described in the same role. That previous team I worked on who asked that contract to me, I was previously on that team, and I built a new API portal. And within that portal, there was this calendar service. And some of the goals with that service were to make the calendar service better performant, easier to use, and more secure. So that I move off that team. That service is all done. I'm on this middleware services team that I talked about being on before. And on that team, we finally get around to actually using the calendar service. Mobile is building a new front-end calendar feature. They're going to use our new service to capitalize on the 3 things we described. I'm sizing it. We size it in our pre-planning, in our planning, and we're working on it. And my developers come to me and they say, this is like not easier to use. This is very, very difficult to use. The JSON responses, so specifically what the API is giving us, doesn't really make sense. And it's going to take them time. We've already spent roughly somewhere between, I want to say like 8 to 10 weeks on it. Maybe not 8 to 10, maybe bugging up the sprints a little bit. Let's say like, I think 6 to 8. We're like getting towards the middle of the quarter. And I realized we're not going to finish by the end of the quarter, and mobile is using the old service, which is unsecured, and they're going through exercises with us to try and understand how to use this new service. So as our consumer, and they're also like, well, it's so difficult to use. What value does it really add? And then we start to dig a little bit deeper and look at the service that the vendor used on the back end. It's also not performant. And at this point, we're really far along in this service is done. We've paid for it, and now we're consuming it, and it's not doing what we want it to do. And in light of all that, at the same time, we were acquired by a larger company. I was at TD Ameritrade. We were acquired by Schwab. There was no longer an edict to move on to all secure APIs because all our platforms are going to be decommissioned. So in light of all the challenges and what we originally bought, which I was in charge of on the other team, not working, I simply just pulled the plug right then and there. I was like, it doesn't matter that we spent all this money. It doesn't matter that, because it is a subset of a ton of other services we got great use out of. It's not worth the time and effort for our teams to go through this. It's not going to give us really what we initially asked for. In a lot of ways, we didn't get what we needed from the vendor, and it was kind of a miss at the beginning. And in a lot of ways, the vendor duped us a little bit. They kind of put lipstick on a pig, to use a euphemism or an analogy there. And we kind of were stuck holding the ball, and we just decided to cut bait.
So as I'm listening to this with my kind of senior leader hat on, the one thing that isn't clear to me, right, in listening to this answer, is why were they working on this project? So the question itself is trying to drive at how well do you as a product manager deliver results as a team lead, or kind of managing resources. It may not be under your direct control, but and the crux of what is trying to be discovered with this question is, do you have the ability to set up the conditions for success, your victory conditions, and realize when you're off track or when things aren't going correctly, and then make a different decision? And specifically, I point at 50% or further along, and it's not clear that they were 50% or more along. There's 6 to 8 weeks was a time frame used, but the thing that really jumps out at me here, though, as he gets through the answer, the candidate, is it sounds like he was working on something that they didn't need to do, right? So he says his company was acquired by a larger company, and that larger company said that there's no longer a mandate to use these external APIs, but they're doing this work. And so my immediate first question is, why were you doing this work? Is it kind of a learned helplessness thing where you're just kind of continuing along a path because that's what you were told you were supposed to do, but it was no longer relevant, but no one came along to tell you don't do that anymore? I don't know any of that. So that's like a huge red flag waving for me, specifically when I hear this answer. But I also am concerned as to how this candidate is describing their process. Getting 6 to 8 weeks into consuming an external API, which is ultimately an external API, but something internally developed that's connecting to an external API. 6 to 8 weeks to figure out that it's not working or isn't good or isn't performant speaks to broken processes. So the two kind of big issues here are, why were you working on this? Why was it important? And secondarily, what took you so long to figure all this out? Right? How did this not align with whatever victory conditions you might have, success conditions and criteria you might have put in place?
I'd love to hear how you were thinking about the definition of success or failure with this particular project.
Absolutely. Yeah. Do you mean specifically the calendar feature?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say, again, easy to use. Well, let's not say easy to use. No, I should. I'll say it one more time. Easier to use than the previous service. Secure, so meaning it's not just an open API. Not everybody out there who finds the URL can use it, and gets us more performance. And in short, it did none of those things. And it was further exemplified, especially in terms of ease of use. Especially in terms of ease of use when mobile tried to integrate it. The one thing I actually need to clarify, my last answer was just simply incorrect, was that it was more secure. That was the one thing it did do. What it didn't do was justify the cost and the struggle to take on that extra security. We ultimately decided, right, even though it's open, it's going to cost us so much more to not keep it open that we shouldn't even build it, especially in light of the new platforms being decommissioned.
But how
When you are structuring your answer in an interview, you'll hear the STAR format is used over and over again. I talk about it all the time, but it is a good structuring framework for how to work through your answer. And it's always good to get as much of the answer out kind of in the first block so that you're creating a situation where you and I, you being the candidate, me being the interviewer, can now have a conversation, an intelligent conversation about decisions you made, things that happened, who did what, who's responsible, all like a good conversation to really establish how good are you at your job. And part of that, or part of your job in that, is to exhibit competency in what you've done. And a very easy trap to fall into, which this candidate did, is to, for whatever reason, whether incompetency or just an innocent omission, an error by omission, is to not use data. Okay? The candidate spoke about performance issues, ease of use issues, and cost issues. I don't know how he was measuring that. I don't know what the targets were. I don't even know what units of measurement they were using. Are we talking millisecond performance? Are we talking minutes performance? Like, there's so many pieces to this puzzle. And in this specific case, you've got a product manager who's working on or with a set of APIs. You have, just by virtue of having that job and wanting that job on a go-forward basis, you need to be a bit more technical in your kind of evaluation and utilization of and integration of things within any services that you're creating. And in this entire discussion, there's ample opportunity for the candidate to offer this up to me, the interviewer, and he doesn't. And it's now creating a problem where in my head, if I'm a lazy interviewer or I'm busy or quite frankly, I'm not good at my job being an interviewer and I don't think to like poke, I can walk away from this conversation thinking very clearly, this person is no good for this role because they didn't offer data, they didn't use stats, they didn't give me metrics, they didn't walk me through their processes, etc. A very good interviewer will ask you those questions because you get nervous and there's all kinds of reasons why he might have omitted this information. But that is a very common trap that you need to be aware of, that you can very inadvertently fall into, especially when walking through something that, kind of you made a different decision or things weren't working. You have to be clear as to why. And you have to be clear as to how you measure that. And if you don't do that, you're really creating a problem for yourself.
How are you tracking, and I think you already alluded to this, but I just want to be clear, how are you tracking the success or the failure of this development path?
For this one, for this service specifically, it was that it was actually done, right? That I was checking API responses to see that it actually came back with the expected data. If I think back on it, how could we have been more successful? And I think, unfortunately, we might have known this at the time, and we've been kind of pressing on it for the feedback, was we needed more, I think, some not leadership, but tech support in terms of what we should push back from a technical standpoint on the vendor. So these sorts of things didn't happen. And thinking back on it, that's where I feel like it was missed. Like we definitely could have, it was one of my first, and this isn't a real excuse, right? It was one of my first bouts with being more of an API and services product manager. And my manager above me in a similar boat, asking for more tech input, but I wasn't kind of driving to have the tech lead on our team look through every single API service. I was kind of responsible for it. So it does definitely come back to me. But I think in terms of success, right? I think if I had been more engaged with a lead engineer on this, they could say, hey, this just isn't up to snuff. We need to go push back on the vendor and have them rebuild it, or simply get it cut out of the contract and not pay for it. That's like a hindsight is 2020. Looking back, I deviated a little bit from the success answer, but hopefully I highlighted some of the lack of success through some of the failures, I think, of why I didn't quite do what we wanted it to do.
There's a lot to be said about displaying ownership of failure in an interview question answer. The point of this question, of course, was delivers results, but in admitting to the failure and discussing how he didn't achieve what his manager had been asking for, there's a great deal of humility and kind of vulnerability here, which is great. The ownership is great. The challenge here is that the candidate has now walked through two separate answers to what was essentially the same question, which was, how are you measuring success? And how did you know that this wasn't working? And in the previous answer block, he listed three things. And in this answer block, he now listed yet another thing, right? Which is whether or not it was working and delivering back the results he expected. And then he owns up to the fact that this was his first time being an API product manager, which that is a very specific kind of product management. Great. Everybody starts somewhere. That's fine. What did you learn? How did you grow? Can you still do it? Like, that's what I'm trying to evaluate if I'm talking to this candidate. But then kind of cops to, well, my manager was asking me for a bunch of stuff that I just didn't do. So that's on me. Okay. Again, ownership is good. That's fine. And he's talking about we'll call it a failure. But this is absolutely highlighting it is even more important that upon reflection, this candidate can look back on that experience and say, here's what I would have done differently. Here's how I would have measured this. Here's the metrics I would have had in place, because I'm much better, smarter, stronger, faster, whatever, as a product manager now. And this is how I would have approached this problem. And that's not what happened here. And so the answer in and of itself kind of falls apart and leaves me as the interviewer a little bit flat in terms of how I think about this candidate. It was a level appropriate story, meaning scope, responsibility, where things can go wrong, etc. And that's good. It's just a lot of vague references to things he could have done differently that he doesn't really follow up on and doesn't really zero out on, which, especially for a product manager, you're going to want to see a bit more data-driven decision-making, and it doesn't land here. And so he missed the opportunity to kind of go a little bit deeper and be, even with the benefit of hindsight, a bit more introspective about how to attack this problem and how he could have done better. Maybe how that would have affected making a different decision earlier, maybe not getting as far down the road on the project. But that's where it kind of falls apart, and it's a great lesson for anyone who's trying to understand how an interview answer can get away from you and maybe not paint you in the best possible light.